Thank you, Alexis, and welcome to Ana Paula Artis. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us. I'll introduce Anna in a minute, but let me just give a little bit of context here. And I think we chose this date or this timing for the webinar because we were trying to find a time in between both of the elections. And what I mean by that is the round 1 and 2 of the Argentine presidential race. And but I don't think when we decided to choose a date in between round 1 and 2, we had any idea how momentous round 1 would end up being. And so I think that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. Um, talking to people the week before the October 25th election and looking at polls, it was unclear whether Governor Scioli would win outright, but certainly he had, in most polls, a huge lead and a significant lead leading up to it. And then the shockwave came across with the Macri results in what was more or less a tie, but either way sent it on to a very important second round on November 22nd. So that's the electoral and political context. And obviously all of this is important because after almost 12 years, there will no longer be a Kirchner in the Casa Rosada. And so there will be change in Argentina come December 10th and the inauguration of a new president. And this, again, is relevant when we look at the intersection of energy and politics because of all of the political decisions and the impact of political decisions on the economy in Argentina, and more specifically on the energy sector. And for years, there have been huge constraints in Argentina's important market fundamentals have not been able to be realized. More recently, that is in terms of the unconventional resource, the world-class Vaca Muerta. Ana Paula will get into that in this presentation, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But I just want to emphasize that Argentina's energy market fundamentals are very important and very ready to lift off almost, given a few adjustments to some of the broader macroeconomic issues in that country. So I think we're very interested to see what happens in the next round of the election. But either way, there's going to be some significant changes in Argentina. And so we're delighted to have Ana Paula Artis talk about her thoughts on that, because she, as Alexis mentioned, is based in Buenos Aires. And for 17 years, Ana Paula was working with Fitch Ratings. She was a member of the board of directors of Fitch Argentina and a member of both local and international rating committees. She was very involved in the oil and gas sector and the energy sector in Argentina. And then a couple of years ago, she co-founded something called Quo Advisors, where she now is a partner and runs that advisory. So we're delighted to have Ana Paula share her insights with us today. It's about a 20-year horizon of experience, and so we look forward to hearing from her. And Ana Paula, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's actually a pleasure to be here today with you and to share the view we have here at Quo Advisors of both Argentina and in particular of the energy sector. And as I would say, as you mentioned in the introduction, like the results we had at the first round of the presidential election a couple of weeks ago was quite surprising to most of the population. So right now, what we see is like there is a tie-break definition between the two candidates, Macri and Scioli. The results Macri got, which is kind of the more market-oriented candidate, were quite stunning, particularly to the leading party, to the Kirchner's party, because actually Scioli had been during the past the big lead. I mean, he had the preferential treatment in any opinion polls that were run prior to the first election. Now it turns out that Macri and Scioli are now very tight in this presidential race, and there is some tension coming up from that kind of relationship. If we look at the main differences, I would like to begin with saying that, first of all, none of them has been quite clear or open, particularly about which policies they are going to implement if they come to office and when they come to office. So what we can talk about is which are the indications or like the not so straightforward things that have been said by both candidates. But I would say that basically Macri, who is now the head of the federal district here in Buenos Aires, he's basically very market oriented and he seems to favor a shock type change with opening the economy and taking all the policies, not just related to the energy sector, but to the economy in general, more to a free market type market as quickly as possible. Speaking particularly about the energy sector, some of the people who are working in his team in energy have said that there might be a transition period. I mean, I would say that although he's kind of favoring a shock type change, it seems to be that there will be some transition period in between. Not everything will be as shocking as one could expect. On the other hand, Scioli, who is now the governor of the province of Buenos Aires, so at the end of the day, we are talking about two candidates who are very strong in their own districts. Actually, he's talking about continuing the current model that we have right now with the Kirchners, but with some moderate changes that would come over time gradually. But again, I mean, none of them has been explicit about the speed or the size of any potential adjustments in the energy policy, in the energy subsidies. So I would say that probably the specifics about what will happen with the energy sector will have to be unveiled by whoever wins on November 22nd. What we could say at this stage is that whoever wins, even if it's Scioli or Macri, it doesn't matter. It doesn't look like the current macroeconomic policies will continue to be in place the way they are right now. Even if Scioli is arguing he will continue with the existing model, that doesn't seem very likely if you take into account the economic numbers that we have right now in Argentina. And I'm referring, and I will talk specifically about that, but in terms of the fiscal and trading deficit, inflation, and etc. So there's not much room to maneuver if Scioli should continue, if he wins, of course, with these types of policy. So at this point, my question is, which are the risks? I mean, which are the risks if one wins or the other wins? And I would say that whoever wins on November 22nd and takes office at the beginning of December, the risk is that there is a failure to timely and properly deliver results. I would say that Argentina is getting into this tiebreak definition with kind of a red flag in terms of any macroeconomic indicator that you look at. So there's really a strong need to make changes. And those changes will have to be made within a plan, and they should be clearly established. I mean, we don't have any changes in current policies, and I mean in terms, of those policies like the ones related to the control of inflation or foreign exchange, which actually, if they are not controlled, there's a lot of instability, macroeconomic instability. If that wouldn't happen, there would be an increasing uncertainty in terms of the future political process in Argentina and the future macroeconomic volatility. Now, I would say that the first question is whoever wins, which is the economic legacy that president will get. If we look like a decade ago, we would say that Argentina overall, although the 12 years policies developed by the Kirchner, Cristina, and her former husband, Nestor, were like against free market-driven policies, actually they had been encouraged or helped or supported by the fact that there was a commodity price boom in the world, and that actually was able to fuel an annual average growth of around 4% for the Argentine economy, despite the policies implemented by the Kirchners. Now, those prices are now gone. So this is why I would say I was referring early today about the need to make changes by whoever takes office in December. So right now what we have is a president, Cristina Fernández, who will be leading the country with a widening fiscal and trading deficit. There's also an energy trade deficit. And these times, the energy deficit is on the one hand because there is a significant need to import natural gas, and also in some cases to import oil. But also there are a lot of subsidies which are not market driven really, which are actually, by market driven, I mean that they are not directed to the people who actually need to be subsidized in many cases. So those two, the combination of those two facts, the subsidies and the need to import, have resulted in a significant amount of money, which is at one point, some economists even estimate that the energy trade deficit is kind of the major component of the trading deficit that Argentina has. Also, the new president will find a double-digit inflation, although this, of course, is not being recognized by the government officials. But depending on the economists you talk to, we are talking for 2015 of an inflation between 25% and 30%. So it's a lot, and this is kind of the third year in a row that it's within those levels. Then we have these capital controls, which on the one hand imply an actual limit to the ability to repatriate dividends for foreign companies. But on the other hand, there's also some limitation or complication in the process to be able to make payments to foreign suppliers in the normal course of business. So in any case, those capital controls not only affect the retribution or the gain that any foreign investor would expect to get from any investment anywhere in the world, but also when we are talking about the normal course of business and being able to import the material needed, for instance, to develop the non-conventional resources, there's still the question of how easy or not it's going to be to pay foreign suppliers. On top of that, there are critically low foreign exchange reserves at the central bank. Again, here, I mean, as you may know or not know, but here in Argentina, it's very good to get access to reliable official numbers, macroeconomic numbers. So again, when we talk about reserves at the central bank, the official number refers to a certain level, but then when the private economists begin to make a depuration of that, seeing what really is cash and what really is liquid and what really actually is the property of the central bank and not something that is there as a deposit, really the reserves are critically low. You may be aware that the official exchange rate is really overvalued. The difference between the official exchange rate and what we call here the informal or blue exchange rate is about 50%. And last but not least, really, is the fact of the defaulted national debt. That the government has been unwilling to negotiate with the holdouts has locked out Argentina from the international markets. And that, and I will get later into that, has a direct impact on the ability to invest in the non-conventional areas here in Argentina. So I would say that with this economic legacy in mind, we should probably ask ourselves, why are really investors showing a renewed interest in Argentina, and particularly in the Argentine energy sector? And I guess initially there are two reasons. One of it is prices. Argentine oil prices are flying high, but this is kind of probably a short-term to medium-term issue. But I would say that the other reason is that the untapped unconventional potential is huge. And I would say that this last one, which actually is what drives long-term investment, is what really is now like attracting investors, which they are having a renewed interest. I'm getting like plenty of calls right now. I didn't get many last year in 2014, but I would say that in the second half of this year, I've seen really a lot of interest from international investors to see what's going to happen here in Argentina and what is the potential to actually come here and participate in the unconventional areas. So, I mean, over a year ago, going back to the price issues here in Argentina, the government set a domestic oil price which was different from the international level. Initially, at that point, when the prices were initially set, the international oil prices were around $100 per barrel, or maybe a little bit over that. So the idea was to get Argentine prices capped in a way to protect the domestic consumer. But then, by August, September of last year, when international oil prices began that sharp decline we all know about, the Argentine prices have still been kept artificially above the international ones. So this, at that point, the rationale behind this change, and it was part of a government effort to actually boost the oil production, I mean, increase the production, maintain it in some cases, to maintain the investment level in the energy sector. And at the end of the day, everything was about protecting jobs. Today, the price differential, depending exactly on the quality of the domestic oil and where it is located, is about 50%. If we take a global oil price of $50 per barrel, in Argentina, we are talking about $75, $77 per barrel. And the big question is, if this policy has actually been effective, or what has been the impact of this policy, which doesn't seem to have any rationale at all at one hand. I mean, it's kind of we are talking about a commodity which is internationally traded. There's an international reference price, and then we have the Argentine made price. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But then, if we look at what happened here, and we focus in terms of the investment level, the capital expenditures that the Argentine mayors had during this year, I would say that most of the major producers maintained their capital budgets intact. And we could argue in that sense that the policy, maybe it was a little bit successful. Investments were maintained in the country. Now, if you look at what happened to the global majors, and maybe if you look just at BP or Shell, they really cut spending in billions of dollars this year due to the price decline. So it's Argentina in that sense has continued to go against like the international trend. And the paradox of this is that now the Argentine consumers are the ones who are subsidizing the oil and gas producers through the high prices at the pump. I mean, globally, the usual thing with subsidies is the other way around, that end consumers are the one being subsidized, generally by the government. But here, right now, with this price differential, the paradox is the other way around. The end consumers are subsidizing the drillers. So it's kind of, maybe sometimes for some investors, it's difficult to get this rationale, because actually there isn't kind of a market-driven rationale behind this. Now, the big question is if this price of this domestic price level can actually be sustained over the medium term. I would say it's rather obvious, but it goes without saying that domestic prices should tend to be near the global oil price level. Again, the presidential candidates, they have not really been explicit about which their energy policy would be. But I would expect that there will be a normalization in oil prices, while the time frame to do that may be different depending on which candidate wins actually the election. I would also say that it's probably that a transition period, as I mentioned earlier, could be defined at maybe for the time at which prices, international prices, continue to be so low. But again, this is still to be seen. And I would say that with this level of prices, it's interesting to see how the industry has responded to the domestic price level. And actually, these domestic high oil prices have created kind of a microcosmos for the Argentine oil and gas sector. So if we measure the industry and the activity in the industry as the number of the operating rigs, you can notice that between October 2013 and September this year, that would be 24 months, the global rigs in operations declined by 13%. But then in the same period, if we looked at what happened in Argentina, they increased by 33%. And this, I mean, the difference we see here with the number of rigs is kind of the same that we saw previously in terms of prices. I mean, while prices decreased globally, the number of rigs and then the level of activity globally declined, while in Argentina, prices remain high, and so the level of activity increased. And here we have to bear in mind that the major player here in Argentina is YPF, which is controlled by the government. It's not fully state-owned, but it's controlled by the government. And it has been the one who has been actually driving or leading the increase in this activity. Then, if more in terms of the regulation, it's interesting to see, while there was this scenario between the domestic economics and prices and the international prices, it's interesting to see what has happened in terms of the regulation under the Kirchner's administration. And surprisingly to some, the government started to slowly kind of improve the policies, basically to promote the investment in Vaca Muerta, the non-conventional area. So these slight improvements came in terms of promoting a new hydrocarbon law, some presidential decrees, and then there have been several agreements signed between producers, governors, and the executive power during the last, I would say, 24 months. The main change has been that there has been an extension of the shale field concessions for 35 years. for those who had areas already in place. There has been also an incentive to participate in this new scheme of 35-year concessions, granting an ability to any producer to export without having to pay for the export tax up to 20% of their production if they had invested over $1 billion in a 5-year period. Now, if you're familiar with the oil sector, you would know that $1 billion in 5 periods, so that in 5 years, that's $200 million per year, is really nothing when you're thinking about developing non-conventional areas. So it's really a very low requirement of investment. There has also been the oil price, as I mentioned, set at $75 per barrel. And then the natural gas price for new developments has increased to $7.5 per million of BTU on average, while on average for the domestic producers, they usually get $4 per million of BTU. So I would say these policies have helped, but at the end of the day, the investments won't come here faster or in greater amounts until actually the country regains access to the international financial markets. Just because the investments needed to develop the non-conventional areas are huge. So there's no way they can be financed only in the domestic market. They really do need the input and the access to international financing. But again, there have been, in order to attract these foreign investors, there have been limitations on the side of the macro factors. And these are the restriction on profit repatriation, the currency and the trade controls, this inefficient process that is in place to import equipment, and again, the limited access to foreign financing. But at the end of the day, it seems that investors are seeming to bet on a change here in Argentina. And I would say that they are betting that whoever comes to the next administration, it's going to have a more friendly oriented administration than the one the Kirchners have had for so many years. I would like to turn specifically to the shale oil potential that we have here in Argentina and the largely untapped resources that we have. If you consider Argentina exclusively in terms, the numbers here you have in green are only related to the oil volumes of the resources. I'm not including there the gas volume. But I would say that Vaca Muerta is widely considered among top shale plays in the world. And the development actually of Vaca Muerta would be a key to restore the country's energy self-sufficiency. Argentina is estimated to have, according to the EIA, 27 billion barrels of shale oil resources and also 802 TCF of shale gas. So that is huge when you compare it, to whichever country globally, aside from the US, but also if you compare it to the level of proved reserves that Argentina has right now, with about 2.5 million barrels of oil and 12 TCF of gas. So this is why, the potential is really significant. Now, if we look up to which countries Argentina is competing here, you can see that you have Russia, Africa, Asia. There are several countries which actually have a lot of potential. But Argentina is, I would say, strategically positioned better than those countries in terms of location, production cost, break-even prices. And I will talk a little bit about it later. So I would say right now, the only country who is producing from non-conventional, massively producing, is the US. So the question is if Argentina has any chances of replicating the success the US had with this non-conventional. And it's interesting to notice that in the US, it took them over 20 years, more or less, to develop the shale industry, while in Argentina, this industry is very new. Then it was mostly developed in the US by the private sector, and here it's been mostly developed by YPF. While, there has been an increase in the participation of the private sector, it's still modest and in the initial stages, I would say. In the US, the drilling activity has been really intense. We are talking about thousands of wells being drilled and explored. And here in Argentina, this activity is very incipient and at a much lower scale than in the US. The US, of course, had a supportive government, and here the energy policy needs to be defined by the next government. So it's still to be seen what happens in terms of regulation. The US had an extensive infrastructure and oil service industry, and here, I'm sorry, here there's a limited infrastructure in some portion of Neuquén, near Vaca Muerta, where already has been production facilities in place for many decades. But then there's need to be a strong development of the infrastructure whenever the shale resources are developed. And of course, in the US, there was access to financing, and here there's a limitation. So to move from a more likely US model to the Argentine model to the US model, the key to that will be, in my view, to have the access to financing. And for that, the next government would need to negotiate with the holdouts and also to establish an energy policy which actually supports any long-term investment. Now, having said that, I think I would like to focus a minute on which is really the company which is going to develop the shale resources going to focus on, and that is actually well productivity. And why is that? Because well productivity is a function of three variables: price, cost, and production declining rate. So if we look at the Argentine approach, right now there's uncertainty about the long-term oil price. We now have the price above international prices, but that doesn't seem to be sustainable over the medium to long term. Then there's a question about cost. If we look at the publicly information of YPF, it says that they have reduced the cost for the vertical wells below $7 million each, and initially those costs were around $11 million each well. But I mean, this is, although this is good news, of course, really it's far away from the $2 or $3 million cost that each well has in the US, where there's already economies of scale. So in terms of cost here in Argentina, there's a lot to be done yet. The other thing is the production declining rate. For non-conventionals, the declining rate is higher than in traditional areas. And for this reason, precisely, the drilling activity needs to be very intense to maintain production levels when it has been obtained. So again, at the end of the day, if we look at these three variables and how they impact productivity, this is also interconnected to the macro factors and the fact that if companies have access to financing and there's legal security, meaning that companies here will be able to repatriate dividends and, of course, access financing and pay foreign suppliers, then at the end of the day, this productivity equation will improve and will make the non-conventional areas even more attractive for international investors. So, which is the competitive position of Argentina? On the one hand, there are good geological quality of the assets of the shale resources. The people who really understand about this, the engineers, which is not me actually, they believe it's similar to Eagle 4 from a quality perspective. It's also good that the non-conventional areas, Vaca Muerta mainly, is located far from urban areas. So any type of social or environmental limitations could be more easily resolved, given that it's far away from any city. There is quite a well-educated workforce, although there's still a need for experienced people in terms of fracking and horizontal drilling, which is the thing that is quite limited. But then, given the decline in global oil activity, I would say that Argentina is well positioned to be able to bring those specialists into the country. There's the new hydrocarbon law, which I just mentioned. And also, which I think is very important, is that whoever takes office in December, there's a huge incentive to regain the energy self-sufficiency. And the only reason, I would say, or the main reason, is macroeconomical. There's an energy deficit. And actually, the energy deficits have an impact. When you look at the interaction of the macro factors, that actually has an impact in terms of the reserves of the central bank. So I would say that the energy agenda would be a main issue for whoever candidate wins. In terms of the adverse things Argentina faces, is that private participants have participated, but in a limited scale. Cost efficiencies are still far away. There's a lot to do there. And again, the limited access to financing. Now, a quick overview in terms of what has happened in the shale activity in Neuquén, which is where Loma de la Lata basically is now producing. We can see that there have been, in terms of the number of non-conventional drilled wells, there has been kind of a turning point back in 2012, and particularly, I would say, in 2014. There's not publicly or formally updated information to see what happened, I mean, right now this year from the same source where I got this, which is the Secretary of Energy of Neuquén. But I hope to get that to you the next time we meet. We can also see that in terms of the number of wells in productions, which they had increased significantly in terms of production in 2014. Now, if we look at what happened just at production levels, non-conventional production levels, there has also been a timid increase, I would say, beginning in January of 2013, kind of stabilizing during the last 2 months. But I would say that the important thing of that is that it seems to suggest that the production of non-conventionals is actually commercially viable, but yet we have to bear in mind that the production curve is too small. There's not enough history. So what is the current status? If we take like kind of a quick look at the industry, YPF is clearly the main player. The vertical wells, when you look at it, clearly outnumber the horizontal wells, which is actually what led the US industry to develop in the first place. Then the oil wells are actually larger than the gas wells. Basically, I would say that the non-conventional gas is produced almost as a byproduct in many cases of the oil production. So it's something that we will need to monitor. Now, knowing that there are huge untapped conventional resources in Argentina, what would investors look at to see which are the key factors that they will focus to make kind of an investment decision or an investment call? Because let's remember, if we go back to the global map and where shale resources and conventional resources were, that Argentina, at the end of the day, will compete with other countries to attract the investors from a non-conventional party. And I would say that the investment decision would be based on the country risk, the business risk, and the financial risk each investor will be willing to take. If we go at the country risk, first thing, the political uncertainty, the energy policy that will have to be defined, high inflation, capital controls, everything we already talked about. In terms of the business risk, complex geology, but apparently similar to the one in the US, so there could be some efficiencies being gained there. There's a high cost, state-of-the-art technological requirements. Some of those are here in Argentina, some would need to be imported. The investments required are huge, and I would say that they would be limited until there's a definition in terms of what will be the medium and long-term price of domestic oil. Going to the financial risks, we are all aware that the financing needs are very high for these areas. The investor appetite for the oil companies will actually depend on what happens to global oil prices rather than what happens exclusively to the domestic oil prices. And the fact that there is limited domestic financing. Now, having said that, I would say that there has been some interest already from market participants. And right now, there are several companies that are listed there which have acquired stakes in Vaca Muerta. So Chevron has a joint venture with YPF and is the one who is already producing. I think they are producing about 43,000 barrels of non-conventional oil per day. Then with Gazprom, there has been an agreement signed, which will be like the final agreement will be signed in a few next months between both governments. Exxon is conducting exploration activities, but in a different part of Vaca Muerta. I would say that Exxon is rather more on the north, while the others are more on the south. YPF has also signed agreements with Petronas and with Dow Chemical. Total has begun to producing its first shale gas. So I would say, I mean, there has been an increase in international interest in these areas, but there's still a lot to do to actually take the development of non-conventionals to the next stage. So I would like to end up by saying that potential for the non-conventional resources here in Argentina is really high, but we all know that riskier investments demand higher returns. So whoever takes office will need to make sure that those returns are in place to attract the investors. There are still some room to improve the domestic regulations, specifically of the industry sector, but also in terms of the macroeconomic security or legal security that we have here in the country. But at the end of the day, I would say that there's an encouraging view that the new president will be able, whoever it is, will be able to make these changes, having in mind that the energy agenda will probably be a priority. And I would say that with that, I thank you all for listening. And I guess, Jeremy, we will open up for the Q&A session.
Perfect. Oh, thank you so much, Ana Paula. That was fantastic. Very, very interesting. A quick reminder, I want to remind folks on the questions, what we'll do is use the chat function. So on your screen there, you'll see something. Alexis has posted a message. It's the main chat tab. And so go ahead and type your questions there, and I'll read them to Ana Paula. There's a lot of things. I've got several questions. I think you made some interesting points about the GDP growth, and yes, there's been important economic development and growth during the Kirchner government, but you had an international global energy commodity boom, if you will. But there's a couple other things I want to ask you about as a new government takes in, and that's the repatriation element of economic policy, because I think that's something that's been one of the key constraints and could continue to be a key constraint. What do you understand to be the opportunity to overhaul or reorient the government's policy vis-a-vis repatriation of dividends? Anything you could share with us on that, I think, would be an interesting way to start, and then we've got a question here, and we can continue to receive some other questions from the audience.
Okay, I would say that a couple of years ago, I don't recall exactly which year it was. I think it was 2012 or maybe earlier than that. Cristina Kirchner prohibited the repatriation of dividends. Actually, the way to do that, as it happens with many things in the Argentine economy, is not explicitly, but sometimes it's through non-explicit regulation. So I would say that probably to make changes in terms of policies, generally, overall policies, not just this one, in some cases, changes don't necessarily have to mean a change in existing law, but just a change in the way, in the mechanisms in which the existing law is being applied. I would say in the energy sector in particular, and I'm not going directly to your question, maybe a broader answer, I would say in the energy sector in particular, with the existing law, there could be lots of changes in the regulatory amendments that were done later, or the agreements between the different parties, which don't necessarily mean that a new law has to be passed on by Congress. Which, I mean, I would say that that is a very important point, because whatever law you need to pass be approved by Congress, whoever wins won't have the majority. So even if Macri won, he wouldn't have the majority in Congress. So it could be a little problematic to do that. But then going back to the repartition specific element, I would say that that needs to be directly addressed. Now, the way to do that, I think I would leave that to an economist.
Okay, no, great. I mean, good answer, good dodge of the. No, that's fine. All right, so hopefully you'll help on this next. There's a couple other questions. Let me throw another one that I have for you, and then I'll pull up some of the ones we have on the chat function here. I wanted to ask you, because you talked about, and we've heard, anyone who's following Argentina and the unconventional resource, the need for massive amounts of investment in capital, and you explicitly said there's not enough domestic finance capital money to do the development of Argentina's unconventional resources. So you emphasize the need to access international financial markets. What are we talking about? What are the numbers, and help play that question out a little bit about what you mean by the requirements and need to tap international financial markets, both in terms of numbers, but specifically in vis-a-vis government policy.
I would say, I mean, if you take the energy sector as a whole and leaving out the non-conventionals, I would say that's like the development of the shale resources is a complete different chapter.
Okay.
But I would say we are talking about at least $1 billion of investment per year in the energy sector. If you think about the state of the distribution network and the transmission network and how I'm thinking about electricity, and how they have been operating on the edge in the last several years. It's not just this year. It's like they've been like that for 5 years in a row, where they are like tapping the key conflict or the red flags they have in their own networks, but they are not really making. They don't have money actually to make all the necessary investments. The way they have been investing to actually deal with those red flags was actually with money provided by the same government. I mean, they didn't call it a subsidy. It was, I mean, I don't know exactly how to call it, because formally it's not a subsidy. It's kind of, they condonated in some cases any accounts payables companies had to the government. For example, for the electric distributors, there was a condonation of the debts that they had accrued with CAMESA. In other cases, it was just a direct financing in the case of Transener, the transmission company, from the government. So that's not the way to carry out business. I would say we are talking about at least $1 billion per year, but probably more than that.
Interesting. And again, you just referenced something you said in your first answer I think is very interesting. And sometimes there's not necessarily explicit policies, but rather the way they managed other policies and at the sort of personal level. I know this government has been pretty famous for how they've dealt with companies and industry. Let's talk about tariffs, because there's a question here, and you mentioned this a little bit. What is your view on energy tariff reform? In terms of each candidate, what are they saying in terms of reforming energy tariffs, and especially power tariffs, which I think everyone's familiar with, the devaluation at the early part of the 2000s and the freezing of tariffs and rates for especially the power sector.
Okay. Again, I would start by saying that there's nothing explicit, totally explicit. So I would say you can read between lines from what people working in the energy sector that are close to the candidates have been telling publicly. I mean, there's not much more information than that. I would say in the case of Macri, he has been closely working with Mr. Aranguren, who was the former CEO of Shell Argentina. He's a person who is very well known in the domestic community because he stood up for what he believed for. I mean, historically, when he was at Shell, and he's very market driven. So he has publicly said that, for instance, he believes that what should be subsidized actually is the demand and not the offer, meaning that what would need to be subsidized are those people who particularly are in difficulties. Right now, the way the subsidies are organized, they are financing majorly, if we're talking about electricity and gas, people who do not need to be subsidized, who would perfectly face the cost of the real cost of electricity or natural gas. So I would say that that's one of the things in terms of tariff increases that one person working with Macri said. Basically, let's subsidize the demand. Let's not subsidize the offer, which I understand means the producers at the end of the day. He also mentioned that there was significant potential for the conventional resources. That Argentina, it's not just about non-conventionals, although the potential is there, but still there's a lot of room to improve production from conventional resources as well. But then on the other hand, if you look at, there's one person working with Scioli, who is not that well known. I mean, but that's just because of the way it is. I mean, no personal opinion on that. But he was mentioning that subsidies would be maintained. He was saying that if Scioli won, he wasn't thinking of eliminating subsidies immediately. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem, I mean, objectively, to be much room of maneuver for that. So it seems rather unlikely that whoever takes office, some changes would have to be made in terms of subsidies, where it is Macri or if it is Scioli. What probably would vary is the moment in which those adjustments would be made.
Mhm.
But again, I would say right now, what is happening right now? I mean, I would say within this week and the next two until we get the ballotage election finally, there's a lot of kind of a black campaign or defamating campaign going on from one candidate to another in particular. So for instance, right now, Scioli is saying that he will maintain subsidies. There will be no changes on anything. I don't really, honestly, I don't think that is true. It's just a way of making a difference from his opponent. Um, so I would say that probably the next 2 weeks, 20 days will be very confusing in terms of which will be each candidate's policy. I don't think we will have any clarity on that.
But you said, I think at the outset, it's interesting because you said even though Macri at one point was talking about a shock type economic program, that's probably unlikely no matter what. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. You heard correctly. And again, let's bear in mind, Macri doesn't say he's not publicly saying I'm going to make a shock change one day from another. That's the interpretation of the analyst when they read what he's saying. But like right now, whatever you read on the news, it's just a contraposition of opinions, which I wouldn't take them, whatever you hear within the next 20 days, I wouldn't take that as what actually any of the candidates is really going to do. They're
But
just
it's
debating
interesting.
to win.
Of course, I think, and this is exactly the point of having the webinar right now, to talk about, but you still have to admit that there's certain things happening with Moody's, where there's changes in how the market is looking at Argentina just based upon, I guess, what you're saying, intuiting things.
Yes.
So let's talk about something. Here's a great topic that we could spend some time on. The question is about YPF, and the question is there any indication that either candidate would treat YPF differently than the Kirchners, i.e. the Repsol expropriation, the hydrocarbons laws,
Yeah.
which was favorable to
Mm,
YPF?
I would say this, if anybody is thinking about, for instance, I would say if Macri wins to give back YPF to the private sector, I don't see that happening. I think that whoever wins in terms of YPF, there would be no difference. I mean, YPF will have the legal ownership it has right now. I don't see that changing going forward, whoever wins. Um, what I do think is that there would be a difference in terms of how the company is managed. I would say that probably we could expect some changes in terms of the directors that would be there and how the policies would be implemented in this mixed company, private and public. But I don't see any change in terms of the shareholder structure. I don't see the company going, I mean, the state selling its stake in YPF. I don't see that happening, even if Macri wins. In terms of the hydrocarbon law, I would say that many people think that the hydrocarbon law that was passed on recently was actually tailor-made for YPF, which, I mean, if you look at it, it is. If you look at the participants in the market, I mean, it was kind of putting everything in place to favor YPF. I don't see changes, particularly in the hydrocarbon law on an isolated basis. What I would foresee is whoever takes office at some point to redefine the whole energy sector. I don't think that right now you can go and change the hydrocarbon law, some electricity regulation. You need to make like an integral diagnosis of the situation and a comprehensive plan. I don't think you can tap or change just the hydrocarbon regulation without seeing what's the counterbalance and impact in terms of the electricity sector. Because at the end of the day, over 50% of the Argentine matrix is being fueled by natural gas. So you will have the impact there. But I think we could anticipate some changes, which I couldn't tell.
So I think that comment you just, and thank you. I think the next question is perfect. The question is about the midstream and natural gas pipeline operators, and what's your outlook for loosening of restrictions on gas pipeline operators and implications for development of Argentina's shale gas?
I would say, I mean, right now, the restrictions the operators have is the ability, the main restriction, I mean, if I look at the operations perspective only, is that they have an inability to export natural gas, and there were a couple of pipelines which had originally been constructed to export energy to Chile or Uruguay. So I don't see, in terms of that, I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think that until Argentina reaches the energy self-sufficiency, I would say that the first priority, the priority of any government would be to maintain whatever is produced here. And once the domestic consumption has been serviced, then export if there's another portion left. Then, I mean, we could go into the fact of the regional integration and
Yeah,
how natural gas could flow from what, I mean, but I think that that's so like far-fetched right now in Argentina that, I mean, we could have probably a conversation about that in a couple of months or years, but I would say that initially nothing would change in terms of that. But on the other hand, what would be needed is to provide, I mean, to normalize the tariffs of the pipelines. If you look at TGN, TGS, I mean, tariffs have been specified and frozen for so many years now. So there's actually need to be a normalization in the activity, in how, I mean, whoever is operating those companies needs to make a gain. I mean, needs to have a result. So, but that's part not only of these pipeline companies, it's also of electric power distributors, electric power transmission. I mean, it's kind of a natural gas distribution companies as well. So I would say that it would take the whole normalization of the tariff scheme for the whole energy sector. I wouldn't see it again as an isolated measure related just to the pipeline sector.
You just, in your answer, you reminded me that at one point, one of the huge issues whenever we talked about Argentina was the number of arbitration cases, the ICSID cases, some of the judgments, some of the pending, associated with all those segments you just talked about and companies involved in those segments of the energy sector. Where does that stand? I mean, where do some of the ICSID cases and judgments, and where does that stand?
Oh, I need to refresh my mind, to be honest with you.
I'm sorry.
No, I don't have a direct. No, it's okay. But I mean, now everybody can know that this is not prepared. Honestly, I don't remember right now. I would say that many cases have been solved out, and whichever companies were, I mean, finally got succeeded in that litigation, some of them had been paid off, some haven't. I don't remember the numbers or the names right now, to be honest with you.
Right.
But there have been kind of diverse situations. There were some companies whose claim was never resolved, some who got it resolved and got paid, and some others who got it solved but didn't get paid. But at the end of the day, whoever comes, whoever comes, the priority would be to resolve the situation with the holdouts in order to tap the international markets, both, I mean, nationally, thinking from a country's perspective, but also thinking about from the private perspective. So in order to do that, all these things about the international courts would have to be dealt with also.
There's a huge to-do list for the next president, no doubt about it. We're almost out of time. I want to ask, two final questions. One is the global price of oil, and you talked about the domestic price and is that sustainable? And my question is, what happens if the price of oil stays where it is, and how that affects this policy in Argentina? If you could explain a little bit more about that and anything. I know you talked about it, but explain more about the potential changes that might occur there, if you know. Then the final thing is, you talked about Gazprom, and so I'm curious, this is also one of these crystal ball questions, the Russia-Argentina relationship under a new administration, is that going to continue to be something appealing to the next president, to the nation? So any sort of geopolitical thoughts, obviously, relative to energy investment. Okay. So there you go. We'll wrap up with those two easy questions.
With the first one. You know, there's never a right answer. Right. But I would say, talking first about the oil price, my view is that the international oil prices will tend to go up a little bit, but there will in no way go back to $100 per barrel. Now, the time for that to happen could be 12 months, could be 24. So I think it's a good question to analyze what happens with the domestic prices if international prices remain at around $50 per barrel, whether they are right now. And I would say, in my view, the logical thinking or the rational thinking would be that the next government should have kind of a contingency plan. I mean, whenever they install the energy plan, there would be, I mean, you have where you are today, where you want to get, where domestic prices are matched up with international prices. Now, how do we do that? So if the scenario of current price, low prices persists, I would believe the best choice would be to have a transition period where, in a way, domestic prices remain above international prices for a little while, not much. I mean, it would depend on how long oil prices, international oil prices are up around $50 per barrel. But what I do not foresee is even, it doesn't matter if it's Macri or Scioli, what I don't foresee is a dramatic decrease in domestic oil price. I don't see that happening. Like, I mean, whoever takes office, I don't see that happening by March 2016.
Okay.
I think that because actually that type of adjustment would have a lot of implications for the sector, levels of employment, the chain of suppliers. It's not just I would say it's not just the oil and gas sector, but it's also whoever supplies the oil and gas sector. So I would say that if you look at the exponential effect and given the size of the sector, the impact would be really felt in the country. So I don't see prices, domestic prices, dramatically decreasing. I would say that there would have to be kind of a transition period by which some rules are established and maybe do that shift gradually, or I don't know if there's room to wait until prices, international prices, reach the level of domestic prices. I would say that those are for me the two roads. I think there's a very small likelihood that price adjustment would be dramatic. So either you leave the price where domestic price where it is, and for the transition period until international prices go back to $75, or you establish a gradual decrease in a transition period again. But I would say it's all about transition.
Transition.
Now,
Okay.
Speaking about Gazprom, I would say it's a fact that there has been an intention of agreement signed, and that the final agreement is supposed to be signed in the next 6 months. I would say that whoever takes office would probably, I mean, pick this from where it was left by the prior government. I don't see, I mean, if I don't know the details about this agreement, so honestly, I don't know if there has any direct implication that for some reason one of the candidates would not like. But if we are talking about a joint development, joint investments, unless you are selling out like the Argentine, I'm trying to think of the word, soberanía. I don't know if you understand what I mean,
Sovereignty.
but
Mm-hmm.
sovereignty. That's right. Thank you. As long as you are not selling that, I don't see a problem with any agreement with any foreign country.
Mm-hmm. So, right, perfect. So from a purely financial investment attractiveness lens, no change no matter what, or not no matter what, but no change it would seem. So, excellent.
That's correct.
Well, it's 11 o'clock here in La Jolla, and I think it's what, 4 o'clock if I have the time right in Buenos Aires with our huge 5-hour time difference. So it's I want to thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate you taking the time to present today. Obviously, there are a lot of questions that can only be answered once we know who the next president is, but we really appreciate you sort of walking through the macro and then, you know, some of the unconventional specifics, some of the price and market issues that I think we've talked about for years in Argentina, but now are really looking at more closely because there may be some changes. So Ana Paula, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Alexis has put the link here for the presentation. We'll get the audio recording downloaded and posted a little bit later today and get that out to everyone. And again, thank you so much, and join us here online again soon or in person. And you see on the screen, we've got some things coming up in Mexico, Washington, and of course, our annual La Jolla conference next May here. So thank you all. Thanks again, Ana Paula.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.